So welcome to everybody who has joined us today. As I said, we have a very broad audience, an audience from all over the world and from science, academia, business, plant breeding, all over the place. It's good that everybody has an interest in this particular topic because it's a very live topic in the moment. I think it's fair to say that when we first proposed this session, we were aware of how big a topic it was and how difficult it would be to wrangle into 90 minutes of a webinar. And yet this notion of blurring the lines between nature and technologies become more and more pervasive in the discussion around gene editing. We're seeing it, for instance, not just in the UK, but in the regulatory discussions around the world. In the UK, it's an outgrowth of the government's industrial strategy, which has become a main driver for agricultural transition. The ability to blur this line is specifically mentioned, though not explored, in a government document on the regulation for the fourth industrial revolution. There are echoes of it also in the framing around the UK's recent public consultation on the regulation of genetic technologies, and the recent government decision to deregulate gene-edited organisms that could have occurred naturally. The narrative is also pervasive in the PR and in the largely uncritical media around gene editing, which talks variously about gene-edited organisms being nature identical and therefore impossible to trace and therefore inevitable in our farming landscape and food system. In essence, what we're being told is that today's technology can create or recreate nature. And it's not entirely clear, at least not to me, whether those who use this narrative mean it literally or whether it's being used as a kind of metaphor or mysticism or a marketing tool. Either way, it's incredibly messy and it's also highly contested. So, for instance, in the recent UK public consultation, it would come as no surprise that a number of civil society and environmental groups challenged the government's could have occurred naturally framing. But so did a lot of organizations that are arguably warmer towards the idea of agricultural genetic engineering, organizations like the Institute of Food and Science Technology, the Microbiology Society, the Roslin Institute, the Royal Society of Biology, who all variously described this framework as overly simplistic, problematic, purely philosophical, exceptionally challenging, and providing no clear criteria upon which we can make regulatory decisions. And we've seen a similar reticence in our own roundtables with plant breeders, where there is an acknowledgement of nature, that is to say, our physical world and all the things in it, but the concept of natural is seen as much more difficult and even troubling. So to my mind, the overarching discussion isn't necessarily nature versus technology, but whether it's possible or not to find an equitable balance between the two. And with that in mind, our panel today is aiming to address this intersection of nature and genetic technologies from a range of different perspectives. Our format is really straightforward. Each of our panelists will in turn give a brief introduction to their thoughts and their work, and we will then open the floor to questions and discussions with my colleague Lawrence Woodward facilitating. It would be really great, audience members, if you could put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. It can be a bit of a roller coaster ride to scan the chat for very specific questions. And other than that, let's just get on with it and see how it works. Our first speaker today is Belinda Martineau. She's a former genetic engineer responsible for the introduction of the Flavor Saver tomato. She's the author of the book First Fruit, the creation of the Flavor Saver tomato and the birth of biotech foods. These days, she is raising questions about the uncertainties of biotech technologies. Belinda.
Thank you. Good morning from California, everyone. I've been asked to comment on whether the concept of naturalness is being used to skew societal discussions of the new technologies of genome editing. My short answer is yes. Yes, I believe it is. And I would like to add that this tactic for influencing societal discussions of genome altering technologies is not new. It has been used by proponents of the technology since the invention of recombinant DNA technology, the original technology that comprises the basic techniques for cutting and pasting together pieces of DNA from different organisms. For example, Stanley Cohen, the co-inventor of recombinant DNA technology, was one of the first to invoke nature to support his newly created means toward altering genomes. Cohen claimed back in 1977 that he and other scientists, quote, can only duplicate what nature can already do. Just a few months earlier, George Wald, a Nobel laureate and professor of biology at Harvard University, had called recombinant DNA technology the biggest break in nature that has occurred in human history. Wald said that such interventions must not be confused with previous intrusions upon the natural order of living organisms. Thus, how natural it is for humans to cut and paste together pieces of DNA from different organisms has been a contentious issue for human society ever since humans have had the ability to do it. By the late 80s, early 1990s, and for genetically engineered or GE crops anyway, the tactic switched to describing GE as an extension of the continuum that comprises traditional breeding. The movie Jurassic Park had come out during this time frame, and genetic engineers were worried that the public might be viewing GE foods as a radical and unnatural departure from traditional breeding. The United States Food and Drug Administration and the founding director of its Office of Biotechnology, Henry Miller, embraced this concept, and the agency essentially based its strategy for regulating genetically engineered foods and feed crops upon it. The idea was that GE was just another, but a newer, and proponents claimed, more precise breeding method to add to breeders' toolboxes. The strategy essentially admits that GE is not a natural process, since, like other techniques of modern breeding, it is used to circumvent nature's barriers, barriers that normally, and by that I mean without human intervention, would prevent the mixing and matching of DNA between different species, for example. And the concept goes further to imply that GE is actually better than breeding techniques, which are positioned more toward the all-natural end of the continuum of traditional breeding, because it is, again, proponents claim, supposedly more precise than other breeding techniques. So the concept of naturalness has been used to support the use of modern genome altering technologies which circumvent natural barriers, both by one, claiming those technologies are only duplicating what nature can already do, and by two, claiming that using them is better than simply duplicating what nature does, because proponents claim they are more precise than older breeding techniques. I don't have time to go into the ways in which genome altering technologies are not precise, but suffice it to say, there are multiple ways, and that GE products with various unintended changes in their genomes have been commercialized. Additionally, we just don't understand enough about the underlying, highly evolved and intricate natural processes in living organisms to know whether we are accurately duplicating them, never mind making them more precise. Richard Flavell, a highly regarded British plant scientist, put it this way in a recent scientific paper. Natural selection has built-in mechanisms to minimize the effects of foreign sequences. As would-be genetic engineers, we have to be alert to these mechanisms. We also must continue to worry about rearrangements from tDNAs and other coincident changes that can accompany the insertion of transgenes. So in the societal conversation taking place today, Both claims, duplicating nature and being more precise than nature, are being made in support of the newest genome editing technologies like CRISPR and TALENs. I worry that the concept of naturalness may distract us from properly addressing the risks, costs, benefits, and unknowns associated with these technologies, or that it could lead to lax attitudes instead of the caution Richard Flavelle says we should exercise. We have very little history of use with these new technologies. We are still learning about the off-target and unintended consequences that can occur when using them. I would hate to see the concept of naturalness skew important societal discussions of the new technologies of genome editing in an unproductive or worse direction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Belinda. I appreciate your being so precise and sticking to time. It's fantastic. It's interesting what you say about having a long history of speaking about gene editing as natural, because of course in those days we didn't have the internet, and now we do. So the narrative spreads much more quickly. Our next speaker is Peter Mills, the Assistant Director of the UK's Nuffield Council on Bioethics, where he directs the Council's work programme on genome editing and works at the intersection of emerging science, ethics, and public policy. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Pat. And good afternoon as it is from London at the moment. I haven't got very much time, so I just wanted to share maybe a couple of observations that I have from the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years at Nuffield. We've been looking specifically into the question of genome editing in farmed animals. And the reason we wanted to do that was that we felt farmed animals in the discussion on genome editing have been a little bit neglected, certainly compared to crop plants, for example. And particularly because they raise sort of distinctive ethical issues in our view, because of, most obviously because many farmed animals are sentient creatures. So what I will do just in the few minutes that I've got is just sort of share a couple of observations about the way in which nature has been used. And in particular, how it's come up in a couple of pieces of public engagement that we've been either directly or peripherally involved in. So, I mean, the first sense of nature that sort of tends to come up in the conversations is perhaps a fairly sort of ancient one, the notion that something has a nature as a sort of kind. And this becomes important because what kind of thing something is determines our moral response to it. So, for example, we treat human beings differently from the way we treat, or most of us anyway, the way we treat certain farmed animals. We treat chickens different from the way we treat salmon different from lobsters, etc. And these kind of differences are sort of enshrined in classifications from sort of Linnaeus onwards. But biologically, I suppose the reason this seems to be important is because the kind of thing that something is, and particularly how it functions physiologically, in other words, how it interacts with its environment, depends substantially on its genome. So the notion that one can intervene in the genome directly carries the sort of implication that one can actually interfere with the kind of thing that something is. And for that reason, it seems sort of particularly morally traumatic to think about it. That's sort of one sense. What I want to talk about now is a sort of slightly different way of thinking about it. And particularly thinking about the interplay of nature and culture, or nature and technology, if you like. And really, the way that I've been trying to approach this is to think about it not particularly in terms of the oppositions between those terms, but in terms of the frame in which they interact. And to think about genome editing in farmed animals, one has to think about the long history of domestication, perhaps going back even as far as the Neolithic period and the origins of settled agriculture. And it's clear, looking down that history, that there has been a long process of biological and social co-adaptation between human beings and the animals that have farmed. And that has resulted in a number of biological and social changes in both, albeit that, of course, human beings, largely through the fact that they have access to culture and language for the transmission of knowledge, tend to have assumed the agency in these relationships. And that's I take it, pretty uncontroversial. But the patterns of domestication that were established in prehistory have pretty much carried on until almost the sort of 18th century. And there is a sense that through this time, what has happened has been a sort of process of kind of fluctuation and recuperation in which people and animals lived alongside each other, which is in a sense captured by this notion of domestication, this idea of living alongside together. But what of course changed with the advent of selective breeding in animals at the beginning of the 18th century, or beginning in the 18th century rather, is rather than that kind of fairly stable process of fluctuation and recuperation, is a kind of acceleration where new breeds began to be of animals began to be developed, and in a way that allowed them to be fitted to particular husbandry systems. But on the other hand, of course, there was a development, there were significant developments through industrialization in human society, so mechanization, urbanization, market economic organization. And it seems that those processes sort of fed off each other. But nonetheless, of course, the underlying mechanism that was involved in fixing and transmitting changes from generation to generation of these animals remained, of course, the genome. Now, the idea that we have a technology or a set of technologies, perhaps now, that proposes to intervene in the genome is something that I would describe as a sort of hyper-domestication, in the sense that that process of exerting control over the transmission and fixation of characteristics is one that has now been sort of explored right down, if you like, to the kind of molecular level. And it also involves control over, exerting control over the kind of circumstances in which the conditions, the feed, the environment, all the other things in which animals are kept. But that sort of hyper-domestication technology has also been accompanied by what one might think of as a kind of de-domestication, or a kind of a separation, where previously human beings and animals were living alongside. Animals now, farmed animals now, are often sort of kept in away from visibility. There is a kind of a sort of detachment, a certain sort of alienation, and certainly a change in the nature of the affective relationships that people and animals have. And this is a kind of a very different kind of frame in which to think about the relationship between nature and culture and those kind of transformations that it's produced. And I want to, the reason I wanted to kind of present particularly that sort of domestic and, if you like, hyper-domestic or post-domestic framework is in order to think about how it makes sense of some of the things that people say or have said to us or said to others in public engagement, public dialogue activities. And I want to draw attention to just two things. The first is an observation that occurred in a piece of work that Ipsos Mori did for the Food Standards Agency in the UK earlier this year. And in framing that discussion, they were presented with the idea that, as Belinda said just now, that what the technologies in question are enabling is a kind of speeding up of nature. But of course, if nature is really this sort of process of accommodation, of variation and filtering and testing through process of natural selection, what is actually happening in these very artificial environments is almost the opposite of that. So if nature is a kind of slowness, almost by definition, and the idea of speeding up nature itself is itself unnatural. So this, I think, is what led to people who were involved in that exercise just kind of being slightly skeptical about that, because there is a kind of tension in this notion of nature that's being presented. The other observation is just one from a piece of a public dialogue that we ourselves commissioned earlier this year with participants from around the UK. And this, again, was enabled a little exploration of the claim that genome editing technologies were continuous with conventional breeding, but just effectively allowed them to be sped up a little bit. And of course, in a sense, the participants accepted that that might well be the case, but nonetheless, they were very skeptical about whether or not genome editing should be implemented, for the reason that they were quite clear that the conventional breeding that I've described as proceeding from this kind of history of domestication had led to some pretty unacceptable outcomes already. And the notion of speeding that up or accelerating it along different trajectories was one that they found particularly found that there was reason for caution. So there's really sort of two things about that. I mean, I think I'll stop there because I know I haven't got very much time, but one of the things that might be kind of interesting to explore is the sort of assumptions that are underlying that. But one of the really kind of salient things for me is the notion that what is really important, and this came out from the public dialogue, is not so much the nature of the technology that you're deploying, or actually its mode of action, but rather the purposes and aims and ends for which it is being done, and whether or not technologies, particularly, and these technologies in particular, these technologies generally, or these technologies in particular, are in some way intrinsically complicit with undesirable outcomes or undesirable trajectories, I think is one of the things that that really needs exploring and teasing out. But I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. Your presentation has prompted a question that you might just want to ponder whilst we move on, but certainly that's something that we've seen as well, that in the public, this notion of why are we doing it? Can we do it another way? Does it need to be sped up? It is repeated again and again in the public arena, at least. Our next speaker is Kathleen Garnett, and she's looking at the question of natural from an entirely different perspective, which is a legal perspective. Kathleen is an expert and consultant in intellectual property rights and environmental law of technology and innovation, and she's currently writing her PhD at Wageningen University on the governance and innovation in the EU. Kathleen.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, for inviting me onto this talk, because as you so eloquently just described, this is something that is really close, not just to my heart, but also to my research interests, because it brings together the question of innovation and environmental risk in one forum. So I'm going to talk today about legal definitions. I'm not going to talk at all about scientific definitions. I want to be clear about this. As Pat was saying, my background is in law. And what I'm going to look at in particular is biotechnology patents. The word itself is there, biotechnology, not bio-natural. So we already see here that technology is already defined in this particular word. I also want to just emphasize at the beginning of my talk, at the beginning of my talk, that this is about agricultural processes and techniques and end products, the complete agricultural forum that could apply to horticulture, agriculture, and forestry. It does not apply to medical applications. because that is a completely separate area of risk and discussion. But often they get confused. So I just want to bring it back to this. It's to do with agriculture. And one of the things that we find in legal definitions is that actually there isn't a blurring of the lines. The law already offers us very clear-cut definitions of what is natural and what is technological. It's just not defined in environmental law, but it is defined in intellectual property law. And this whole question of nature and technology has been debated for centuries, actually, the distinction between what can be described as a technological invention and what is a natural phenomena is actually debated quite extensively and has been done in the past in intellectual property rights. This is for a number of reasons. For a long, long time, you couldn't even patent a living organism. There were exemptions, and this was for moral reasons, because a lot of people, of course, traditionally were very God-fearing, and they believed that it was God's natural invention and creation, and mankind couldn't invent that. But it was also for practical public policy reasons, because they didn't want one person having a monopoly in the natural living world, because that would be unjust and incorrect. You couldn't give somebody a monopoly on the woods, the trees in the woods, or the grass on the field. So what I'm looking at is, in particular, the criteria that that a bioengineer has to apply for if they want their biotechnology patent. And we do know that in a lot of novel genomic techniques, a lot of researchers are engineers. They define themselves as bioengineers, and they are very interested in getting patented technology. It's how a lot of them earn their money. Not just, but it is an interesting source of income for them. We know that Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, who invented CRISPR-Cas9, who got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for CRISPR-Cas9, have a number of biotechnology patents, not just in plants, but in animals as well. So I just want to walk through very quickly the criteria that they would have had to apply to get their patents. There's 3 criteria. The first is novelty, the second is inventiveness, and the third is industrial. So when they presented the patent authorities with their new CRISPR-Cas9 technology patents for animals, insects, plants, whatever it was, microbes, the patent authorities will have done an extensive search of the existing state of art, the existing knowledge, because one of the criteria is that you have to create something that is actually innovative. They don't want you reinventing the wheel. We know about the wheel, you have to give us something completely new. And the state-of-the-art search means that they go through an extensive database, not just of scientific journals, but also common knowledge, existing knowledge, local skills, to see whether there is any knowledge on this. And if there isn't any, then they've passed the first hurdle and they've passed the novelty test, which is great for them. But for us, it's interesting because it tells us a number of things. First of all, it tells us that we can't define this as traditional or conventional, because it's not, it's absolutely new. So any reform of novel genomic techniques has to bear this in mind. It would be incorrect, legally incorrect, to define this as traditional or conventional agriculture. The second thing comes back to the question of risk. When you are trying to do a risk assessment, a scientific risk assessment, you need to have data on which you're going to base your assessment, because you have to try and predict where the harm is going to emerge. But these things are so novel, we know that there is no data. So it becomes very, very difficult for a risk assessor to try and do a scientific assessment. The most they can do is speculate or have a guesswork. And I think the risk with novel genomic techniques in agriculture is not so much the toxicity of it. I think we all accept that eating a savor flavored tomato, for example, isn't necessarily going to kill us, but it might have, and we suspect it probably does have, a number of indirect risks on the environment. Genetic diversity being one of them, because these things tend to create monocultures that are going to lessen genetic diversity, not increase them. So that's just one, for example, but there are a number of other huge environmental variables that a risk assessor has to take into account on very, very limited data because of this novelty aspect. Right, I have to speed forward, so I'm going to go on straight to the second one, inventiveness. This is also really crucial to this question of nature, because when they're applying for your biotechnology patent, you have to prove to the public authorities that this isn't a discovery in nature. Because you are an inventor, you are going to have had a technical effect. You might have discovered something in nature, which is all fine and dandy and very interesting for science. But what the patent authorities are looking for is that you have isolated it from nature. You have taken that gene out of its natural environment and you have given it a technical effect. And if you can prove that you have done that, then you have passed the second hurdle for patent application. So this inventiveness criteria is key to understanding the distinction between something that is technological and something that is natural. So we know that if you have got a biotechnology patent for your novel genomic technique, it cannot be natural and it should not be defined as natural in any revision of some kind of environmental bill, either in England or in the EU. And the final criteria is industrial. You have to show to the public authorities that your invention, your applied invention that is not natural and is completely novel, can be put to some kind of industrial use. And we see this a lot with the GMO technology, of course, that they have been put to industrial use. You can go over to Argentina and Brazil and see the huge monocrop plantations of GMO soya, same in North America. What we see is that with a biotechnology patent in the life sciences, the whole criteria is pushing agriculture towards monocrop cultivation and industrialization. And this also is very problematic for an environmental bill to try and describe it as sustainable, as regenerative, as stewarded, or conventional. The final point I'd like to say, just to wrap it up, is that patents are time limited. You have a 20-year monopoly, generally speaking. So you have an incentive to constantly create something new, because either you can't repatent what you already have because there's already existing knowledge around it, so you won't get your patent again. So often what you find is that bioengineers are looking to constantly create a new technology that they can then profit from, which is why perhaps we had GMO 10, 15 years ago. It's now considered very passé and old-fashioned, which it is in these kind of terms. Today, it's all about CRISPR-9 technology, but who knows, in 10 years, it might be yet a completely new technique about altering the living organisms in the biosphere. And this is partly because of the pressure that bioengineers are under commercially to try and constantly think of new forms of intellectual property right protection. So I hope I've managed to stick to my time. I've tried to race through it. But that, in summary, I think tells us that actually, legally speaking, there isn't a blurring of lines. We have some very clear definitions in intellectual property right about distinction between what is natural and what is not natural, between what is technological and what is not technological. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yes, I think it's obvious that the argument around natural is quite clear as long as you're looking at through a very small window, and the more you open it out, the more questions there are. Our next speaker is Julia Wright. Julia is an associate professor at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience in Coventry. She's also chair of the UK Biodynamic Agriculture Association with an interest in ecopsychology, green ecology, and traditional knowledge systems. So she's bringing yet another facet for us into this discussion. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. And yes, it is a slightly different facet, but complementary. So I really wanted to make 2 points that are interrelated based on my experience over the last few decades working in international development with communities around the world, as well as in the UK. And both points relate to the worldviews that we hold. And the first point is really a case study that I was involved with. It's just one of many projects that in the international development world we get involved with, and it was to do with the situation of drought in a Caribbean country. It was in Cuba in the middle of the 2000s, and there'd been a series of droughts in Cuba for the past about 4 or 5 years. And they were looking for solutions. And at that time, Bill Gates was developing and promoting that he'd invested $150 million in developing new GM maize varieties to help feed the world. And so we were in Cuba working with some researchers and 2 local communities. We had a very small budget. Over the last few years, because of the drought, livestock had been dying. There was no milk production. They couldn't even plant maize, which was a staple crop in the east of the country. So what we did was we got together with local researchers and local community groups and set up 2 farmer research networks. And the first thing we did was to look at the water cycle, because we're talking about drought. So we all analysed the water cycle from the rain, down to where it landed on the ground, and then it flowed underground or into the rivers and out to the sea. So the idea was, how could we capture that? We're looking at taking a systems approach. How could we capture that water more efficiently and effectively? And we could do that by building sort of reservoirs or ponds, capturing in the plants, in the biomass above the ground, or increasing the soil water retention capacity to capture that water in the ground and not let it run off. And then we applied various organic or ecological techniques to enable that capture, whether it was stopping evapotranspiration by having shade crops, increasing the soil organic matter, corralling livestock and using the manure in a more effective way. And we also introduced a lot of new varieties to the region, but they were collected from other parts of Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean, and not just maize, which was one of the example crops that they were interested in retaining, but also other horticultural crops as well. So we only had a year to do this project. At the beginning of the year, all the communities said that drought was the major issue for them. At the end of the year, when we asked them what are the major issues, drought ranked 4th. In fact, they said drought isn't an issue for us anymore, because they changed the microclimate, they changed the environment. They weren't just growing a drought-resistant maize, which would have been Bill Gates' solution. They were growing a variety of other maize, land races and whatever, but also other horticultural crops. And when we asked them what the main outcome of the project was, they said, well, all our children have shoes. And that was because they were growing more vegetables and more varieties, they could open a local market in the villages that they'd never had before. And then various people were earning extra income also by sharing seeds and selling seeds. So they had more disposable income to buy shoes for their children. So if you compare that outcome, which was, we had a minimal budget in 1 year, to the amount of money that was being invested in GM technology, as our American colleagues would probably say, it's a no-brainer which one you'd go for. GM, and we know that was old GM technology, but even at the time, even those maize crops would have needed some irrigation, not zero irrigation. They'd have probably been propped up with some agrochemicals, and the farmers would also need to be buying the seeds every year. So that was a very basic comparison, which I just think is really important, just to ground this, because we're talking about farming and food systems. But then what does that mean? And to me, seeing the way we've been farming, we do farm with an industrialized mindset in the West and has emanated from the West. And that's related to the whole worldview, the industrialized worldview, how we see our relationship with nature or with the rest of nature, and how we view ourselves. And that is a recent mindset. It's only come about in the last few hundred years, and it's not held by other cultures around the world. And we need to be clear about this. We have been a minority worldview, and it has been spreading around the world, but this isn't something that other people don't see the world like this. And in really helping me to understand this, I've drawn from the work of a psychiatrist called Ian McGilchrist, who's written a book a few years ago and now just issued another one, and his first book was called The Master and His Emissary, and then The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And he explains in neurobiological terms how our left and right hemispheres of the brain in the West he calls it a disorder, or that we're actually deluded, that the right hemisphere, which is meant to see the bigger picture, understand soul and connection with nature and the arts, has been sort of suppressed by an over-dominant left brain, which should be the gopher. It should be the part of the mind which is carrying out instructions. And it is reductionist in nature, and by its nature, and it's taken control in the Western mind. And he talks about what to do about that. But I found that really helpful, because when we look at communities in other parts of the world, for instance, in North America, when the settlers arrived, some of the First Nation peoples called the settlers, and said they had a mind virus, which they termed wetico, was their term for it. They said it was a mind virus, which was only focusing on the material, the physical aspects, and was more concerned with accumulation of physical resources and greed and some of the other negative characteristics associated with that. So, that kind of puts us in our place in a way. And then following that, a declaration which has come out in the last year is that there is a declaration from Indigenous leaders and organisations called Whitewashed Hope, which, if you Google that term, you can find it very easily on the internet. And it's a very simple 2-page declaration which actually critiques alternative agriculture movements in the West, like permaculture and the regenerative agriculture movements. And it's saying that we won't really solve the climate crisis and other issues if we stay stuck in our material mindset, and that we need to sort of practice and bring in other aspects and understand and embrace other aspects of who we are and what we are in the world. And two of the key points they make is, firstly, that we are nature. But if we're deluded, as Ian McGilchrist says, we may be nature, but we may then think, oh, well, GM is natural because it's coming out of us and we're natural. But if we're deluded, then it's, it's a bit of an aberration. So there is an issue there. But these Indigenous leaders in their declaration say that we're more caretakers and weavers with the rest of nature. Our role is weaving. And so that's a very interesting concept if we look at it like that. And then they also point out that all matter and energy is consciousness. And Ian McGilchrist says that animacy is the norm in this kind of worldview. So everything holds a consciousness, and then that leads on to our connection with that, our conscious connection with that. If we practice that, we can consciously connect with the rest of nature. And when we think of nature as being conscious and that we can have a collaboration with it, we need to rethink how we are relating to nature, that instead of controlling it, thinking we can do whatever we like, maybe we should ask permission, which is what a lot of Indigenous communities do. And if you ever study bushcraft or foraging, we're often reminded to ask permission before we even, saw off a branch of a tree if we want to create a fire, let alone start, meddling with DNA or whatever. So I think there's something there, and to my mind, and seeing this progression in industrialized agriculture, if we don't change this worldview, even if we don't go down the GM route, the industrialized mind will come up with something else, because this is just a manifestation of this sort of deluded worldview that I have as well. It's not an us and them situation. So I'm saying if we just solve this, something else is going to come up. So we really need, part of the issue one of the issues we need to tackle is looking at our worldviews and seeing what we can do about that. And various authors and other groups, have suggestions. So I think I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. You've prompted quite a few comments in the chat about parallels between what we're talking about now and what's going on at the COP at the moment. So it'd be interesting to address those. I want to check, Lawrence, my colleague Lawrence Woodward, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, maybe you could come on camera because you're about to be a star. We have one more speaker, which is Trina Antonsen, who is a researcher and manager of the Rewrite Project at the Genome Center for Biosafety in Norway. Trina oversees a project that looks at the human-nature relationships and how our perception of nature influences and is influenced by emerging technologies such as genome editing. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Trina, that you're proposing that there is another way to look at this rather than just as a risk and safety of dynamic. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Pat, for inviting me to this seminar. So as Pat said, I will present is an output of the research project Rewrite from Genome in Tromsø, Norway. And it's a humanities-based project, although we work interdisciplinary. And we investigate how human-nature relations are valued, perceived, communicated, and changed in and by modern biotechnology. And we focus particularly on genome editing. I shall talk about the fundamental issue of how we understand the human-nature relations in biotechnology. And this work, I should say, has been done also in collaboration with another environmental philosopher, Professor Christopher Preston from the University of Montana. So as we have already heard much about in this seminar, our relationships to other organisms in biotechnology is often conceived in terms of naturalness. The normative authority of the natural is strong, but it's also contested, and in both in science and philosophy, as well as varying in meaning between contexts and cultures. We also take it to be connected to a static understanding of what a species is. And as we are all know, the questions of transgenic versus cisgenic GMOs have taken up a lot of space in the debates of what distinguishes GMOs from genome editing. And this is due to the naturalness frame. So what I and Christopher have proposed is that rather than focusing on naturalness, it is more productive to think of the relationship between humans and non-human organisms in terms of a negotiation of their respective integrities and agencies. And it should be the effects on the quality of the relationships that guide our actions and decisions. One benefit of this framework is that it makes us more aware that the questions regarding use and regulation of genome editing techniques and other GMOs are ethical rather than merely scientific. So what I will do is to present how we understand the two notions, and I'll start with integrity. The safeguarding and the negotiation of integrity is a necessary part of all relationships. And it's a notion that gets applied from the ecosystem all the way down to DNA. The scientific connotation involves the idea of the wholeness, completeness, and capacity for self-regulation of a complex system, like a cell or an organism or a genome. Used this way, integrity has links to the idea of biological function and stability. The moral connotation points either towards a person or organism's self-organization or autonomy. Aldo Leopold was the first to advance an ethic on environmental ethics based in integrity with respect to the biotic community. And more recently, integrity has received attention in debates about standards of organic farming. With organismic integrity in mind, it has, for instance, been proposed that a relationship with plants should be one of cooperation and partnership. Or to put it the other way, we fail to respect the integrity of life if the quality of our relationship with a living entity is one of exploitation and control. So to sum up, we take it that all organisms, cells, and genomes become what they are through networks of relationships. And integrity at all levels is both contextual and relational. And this means that our notion of integrity sits awkwardly alongside individualistic and reductionistic approaches to plant and animal life. So I will move on to the second conceptual tool of this alternative to the naturalness frame. Alongside integrity, we also believe it important to acknowledge agency on all levels of biological organization. So we can have a narrow or a broad understanding of agency. At its narrowest, agency is restricted to those who possess the capacity to form rational intentions to do things, such as humans. But in a broader sense, agency is the property of acting on something. This notion of agency reflects the power to initiate an event. It does not require intentions or reasons to motivate the action. Instead, agents can be described as responding to their situation according to their function. In animal studies literature, for example, it is increasingly appreciated that agency of often is the best explanation of animal behavior. We believe that the behavior of genomes is consistent with a minimal account of agency. In the ordinary course of events, there are spontaneous activities in the genome which occur independent of external causes, such as mutations. And in addition, the genome shows a tendency to respond to external causes, but often in unpredictable ways. For instance, mutagenesis occurs when a genome is subjected to chemical or radiative stress. And many researchers performing CRISPR experiments are reporting on unpredictable and surprising consequences of the intentional breaks caused by using the Cas enzyme. In both cases, the genome can be described as doing something. It demonstrates an ability to respond to the surrounding world and the changes in relationships to which it is subjected. And in the long run, this is clearly a good thing, because without mutations and these spontaneous changes, evolution would never take place. So together, the notion integrity and an increased awareness of agency creates a mild presumption of non-interference. Although the relationships are not between equals, we can come to acknowledge the reciprocity of relationships when recognizing the presence of agency on both sides. And as with humans, negotiation can only take place when we accept that the other being is more than a thing, that it has its own way of life and a characteristic form. Acknowledging that we are negotiating a relationship with a living being makes breaching an organism's genomic integrity and disrupting various aspects of its agency. It makes it an ethical decision that demands justification. Thank you.
Thank you, Trina. It's interesting that there's elements in what everybody's saying in everybody else's presentations here, and you've sparked, all of you sparked a number of really interesting questions in the Q&A. Lawrence, I'm going to turn this over to you now to put some questions to our panelists.
Thank you. Where to start? Well, let's start with the title. The title of this webinar is Blurring the Lines Between Nature and Technology, which implies the idea of a spectrum at which nature is at one end and technology is the other. Because if you're on a spectrum, then you can blur the... Whereas several people have referred to nature as an intrinsic quality, an intrinsic part of a being. And there was one question from early on in the conversation, has just been repeated, where someone was saying that surely nature is something that has no interference from the outside. If there is interference, or if there's a change, if there's agency, to use the term people mentioned, then it ceases to be natural. So two thoughts then to kick off. Does anyone agree with that or disagree with that, that there is something at one end of the spectrum called nature, and that if you interfere with it in any kind of way, it ceases to be natural? And does that help, any of that kind of view, help in understanding where lines are blurred? Because again, Belinda made the point initially, and I think everyone would agree, that the use of the term natural or naturalness is a tactic, and has been a tactic, to skew public discussion, which is fair enough. But then to say there's something that's natural, or to say that there is something emerging, a blurring, a gray area, does not, that statement that it's skews public discussion doesn't mean to say that it doesn't exist, that there is, that it's not a valid observation, that there is something called nature, there is something called technology, and that agency or interference destroys the naturalness. So does anyone have a view on that? Okay, yeah, Julia.
So I just a couple of comments based on what I'd kind of said, that my sense is that, and what I gather from other people with other worldviews, is that we are nature, we are part of nature. So there isn't a separation. There's no separation. So, but also that we have obligations. We're not just free in nature, we have obligations, and this idea of caretaking or weaving is part of that. So although we are part of nature, we don't just, it's not a playground for us. So that's another belief, that nature's our playground and we can do what we like with it, but there's a hierarchy and we're, you know, top of the hierarchy or whatever. So I think that's all part of it. But I mean, I think, you know, when I've been seeing, you know, conventional plant breeding, I think we also need to rethink that then. If we need to rethink everything we've done through new eyes, because, you know, rather than say, well, gene editing versus conventional plant breeding, that doesn't mean that plant breeding has been perfectly fine anyway. So I think, you know, there are other discussions to be had and reflections to be had. Thanks.
Okay, well,
Kathleen had a comment.
sorry, Kathleen, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, because it's a very interesting question about, you know, pure nature, you could say, is this very fashionable term, rewilding, where you just let everything go wild. And farmers, you know, traditional small-scale British farmers have a problem with this, because, you know, they are still producing food. And there is a human intervention in that. Since farming began, 15,000 years ago, there has been some human intervention in the natural process so that we can live effectively. But I think this is where the thing about intellectual property rights becomes quite interesting, because I don't think we should look at it necessarily or just on human interference, but based on traditional know-how. And what I thought was very interesting with what Julia was describing about this one-year project in Cuba, I think it was, that they actually fell back on what they knew traditionally. What was good for their local environment had always worked. It was traditional knowledge that was reapplied. It wasn't an unnatural technological GMO solution that Bill Gates thinks is a solution to our climate problems. So I think that there is a spectrum, but it shouldn't always necessarily just be viewed from, we have interfered, therefore we have broken nature. I think it should be, you know, how much space are we giving to traditional knowledge and traditional know-how that has actually succeeded mostly in the past?
Okay, there were several questions that came up, Kathleen, in your talk, which I think maybe you could expand a bit on this. So there's one question about how can the European Patent Office grant patents on non-GMO varieties or on things that are part of, that may be considered part of nature or semi-nature or non-industrialized. So how can those patents be granted? What's the explanation for that? And would you agree, following on from that, with the statement that there should be no patents on seeds?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question, because like I said in my talk, for a long, long time, you couldn't get a patent on living organisms. It was completely, you know, out of the question for a number of reasons. That all changed in 1980 with a big case in the US called Diamond and Chakrabarti, where the Supreme Court in the US decided that, yes, you could take a patent out on a living organism. At the time, it was just a small microbe. And I think the key answer is that if you can show that you have had a technological effect on something, that you have engineered it as an inventor, then you fulfill the patent criteria. And the Supreme Court judges at the time said, well, what's the difference between a living organism and inventing a new printing press? You know, if you have shown that you have come up with something that nobody knew about beforehand, if you have shown that you can have a technical effect by isolating this particular bacteria out of its natural environment, giving it some technical effect, so it's now applied science, it's no longer the pure sciences, and then you can use it. In the case of Diamond Chakrabarti, I think the microbe was used for cleaning up oil spills, for example. That was its industrial application at the time. So that is how they managed to get around this thing about patenting living organisms. But there is still this very strict criteria that you can't just say, I discovered a new botanical variety in, you know, Colombia, I'm going to patent all of that botanical variety of plant, or I've discovered a new animal or a new microbe. You have to show that you have done something inventive. And this is why I come back to my original thing, is that actually the law has been debating the distinction between nature and technology within this context of patent. And that's why it offers us a very interesting framework to look at when preparing environmental legislation. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think it does. Slightly moving forward, at the start, Belinda made the point that, I can't remember exactly the quote, but the onset of modern GMOs is I think the quote was, is the biggest ever break with nature, which would sort of indicate that that view doesn't see a spectrum. So it sees that that was clearly a break, but in the chat, to counter that, in the chat, in a question from Wendy Harwood, Wendy made the point that yeah, but you know, mutations, whether occurring naturally or through mutation breeding, can give the same outcome as gene editing, and therefore, and if that gene editing can be done in a quicker or more precise way, if it can be done, and I know there's a controversy about whether it can or not, then surely it would make sense, and surely to use the points that Peter and Trina made, that the agency, therefore, is not so damaging. The agency is maybe is more benign than the previous clear breaks. Could you comment on that, Belinda?
Well, to me, the outcome being the same is getting back to this idea of looking at the products of these new technologies versus the process through which they were derived. And that's where I think we have to take into account how much we don't know about the underlying intricate biological systems in these organisms. And so I have always been you know, in disagreement with this idea that's been put forward in the US in regulating these products of these technologies, that you only need to look at the product. And that is to this point. The process matters, because in the process, unexpected, unanticipated things are happening. And so we have to look at the process. Even if it looks the same, the product looks the same. I got here through traditional breeding versus I got here through genome editing. You could have all kinds of off-target effects with a new technology that you don't even know how to look for. So that's my response.
Okay, so the process.
Sorry, Pete's got a hand up.
All right, Pete. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you a question, but carry on.
Sure.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I mean, I sort of agree with what Belinda says, but I mean, I do think this question of the rupture and continuity is really one perspective, in a sense, or at least how you kind of frame the question. Whether something is the same or whether it's different really kind of depends on where you're standing, and that is just really to draw attention to the importance of the sort of broader circumstantial factors. And the reason I say that is because I'm also interested in process, but I'm not particularly, or I'm not so much focused on the mechanism, the sort of microbiological, molecular genetic mechanism that is being used, although I think it's very important, and I think the sort of analytic characteristics of that process are important for all the reasons that you mentioned. But I think the other part of the process that one needs to think about is the way in which, for example, technologies of various sorts will get taken up through processes, social processes of innovation and diffusion and normalization, and become sort of pervasive technologies within a particular society, or within a particular sector. And I think that is the kind of important thing, that sort of context, and how the sort of forces operating on the uptake and diffusion of technologies are arranged, that a lot of people are very wary of. And I think that is really one of the areas that we need very much to kind of focus our sense of caution on. So, for example, I mean, you know, the fact that somebody invented you know, glyphosate or something is not responsible for monocultures, but it's certainly one of the things that may well have sort of propelled them to the sort of current pervasiveness. So, thanks.
No, thank you. I was going to come to you to respond to Belinda, or to raise the issue about process, because several people mentioned in the chat or raised points when you were speaking in the chat about naturalness and the issue of that you mentioned in terms of, again, agency and whether or not the process or the end result is intrinsically undesirable, whether the outcome is undesirable or not. You seem to be saying that was very important to you. But at the start, you talked about nature as in, if I understood correctly, you talked about nature as intrinsic value. In terms of animals, what Peter Stevenson from Compassion in World Farming has called the animalness, and the conception or the perception of that intrinsic value, that intrinsic nature, leads to, especially with animals, leads to moral views and moral stances. And there is certainly no question, I would say, that there is a greater deal of suspicion around genetic engineering in animals than there is in plants. That probably follows from that. You then went on to make the point that domestication has altered the intrinsic nature of animals, that are the environment in which domestication has happened and how close we are to them may well have altered the animalness, how animals behave. So, and you made particularly the point about hyper domestication, which Julia probably called industrialization. So is there a conflict there? You made the point about this, the agency, the importance of the agency being speed, or maybe the speed altering the boundaries and scope of domestication, and that seemed to be a problem, and whether that leads to an undesirable agency, or an agency which leads to undesirable outcomes. So several people were saying, okay, what could you expand on that, or what does that mean more? What's lying behind those views?
Okay, thanks, Lawrence. I mean, I think there are sort of several things in there. The point that I was trying to make about the sort of valorization of the kind of intrinsic nature of animals, or any other being for that matter, is really that one gets oneself into a bit of a dilemma if you kind of hypostatize that value in the genome, because of course your ability, I mean, genomes alter, right? I mean, this is one of the things that has happened through the course of you know, the history of, well, through the course of evolution, through the history of domestication. So if you're if you treat the genome itself as something sort of inviolable, and that has intrinsic importance, then I think you become somewhat at odds with evolution. And but the dilemma is then that, of course, in order to ascribe a kind of conservative nature to something, you find yourself moving in the direction, or in order rather to anchor a kind of moral value in something inherent within an organism, you find yourself moving in the direction of you know, the soul, if you like, the kind of you know, the thing to which you attach this kind of imprescriptible, inviolable, inalienable dignity of a type that a particular kind of being has. And you enter the kind of domain of sort of metaphysics in doing that. And what I was trying to suggest actually is that maybe a better way of thinking about this is really rather than opposing, rather than producing these kind of oppositions, is to think in terms, think about the framework in which those sort of relationships between, if you like, the inside and outside the self and the other, the technological or the cultural and the natural sort of precipitate out, and those relationships themselves. I mean, I guess perhaps there is a little bit of a kind of segue into what Trina was saying there, but the quality of those relationships, I think, is probably important when you talk about a kind of end state. I mean, I don't know about end states. I mean, I think the end state is probably catastrophic. But what I think is more interesting about this is the trajectory in which you're moving, and it's very clear that there is a kind of trajectory that you might characterize as accelerating potentially along an industrialization pathway, or what I've called a sort of hyper-domestication and de-domestication, this kind of slightly paradoxical confluence of moves. Accelerating in that direction, you know, changes the kind of character of those relationships in a way that I think you have to think about on that sort of broader scale, in terms of what the kind of implications are for those organisms that are kind of swept up in it. So I'll stop talking there.
Okay, well, thank you. That was very helpful, and as you say, it links to the kinds of things Trina was saying. And if I've understood that, the two characteristics or criteria, maybe that's not the right word, that you highlighted, Trina, was one was the relation, what an organism is, and you refer to wholeness and to capacity for self-regulation and integrity, and then spoke about agency as the other kind of criteria. So I just see you've got your hand up now, so maybe you can say what you were going to say in that. An agency in terms of functional and behavior. The point, negotiating this relationship of agency is a matter of ethics. So is that, and you're suggesting that we can avoid any conflicts and challenge over the word naturalness by focusing on integrity of the organism and the nature of the agency, negotiating an ethical relationship. How would that be put into place? How would that be regulated? And would it be different between animals and plants, for example?
Thank you. I don't have the answer to all those practical dilemmas that we will have to solve, but I think that's so I think our framework points in a bit of a different direction than the naturalness, and because I think that often the debates when we consider only naturalness sort of hides away the ethical or value aspects of the debate, and it's up to the scientists to decide if a process or a product is natural or not, and that sort of normative authority or allowing what is natural and not what is unnatural is so strong. And I think it's important to, if not replace, then at least sort of develop and expand the discussion into something that is more explicitly ethical. I think these debates are sort of already ethical, but it's kind of hidden away in some of the debates. And so when I raised my hand, I was going to say that I think both sort of product and process is central, because if you follow sort of my logic and my proposal, and then we need to sort of change our perspective beyond what is natural, and maybe the natural frame is good for considering risk, but when also considering values or socioeconomic issues, then it's sort of, I think it leaves much of the value debate to a matter of a scientific fact or not, whether something is natural or not, and that is disputed in itself. So I think that attention to processes, and also and the development of seeds or animals using these techniques, they makes us, I think it's important that we raise awareness of what's happening, in a sense, and also that the scientists are become more aware themselves about sort of the role of these highly normative terms, agency, integrity, and that also the public is given sort of more information about how their relationships sort of unfold in a biotech laboratory. So in my work in Rewrite, we also focus on what is developing relationships and good relationships and attitudes is through practices and involvement in practices. And we try to focus on the food chain as not only from farm to fork, but from laboratory to fork, and see that whole chain as being sites of relationships between humans and non-humans as unfolding.
Dominic Glover and a few other people have made the point in the chat and questions that one difference about genome editing technologies, and particularly now gene editing, is that it gives humans the capacity to intervene and to alter at a level that we've never before in history had the opportunity to do. We've never had the agency to go into a genome. And Trina, do you see this as this altering where the level of the integrity of an organism is? I mean, the organic and biodynamic plant breeders, for example, rule out any kind of plant breeding that intervenes below the level of the cell. Do you see this thing moving depending on different levels of the organism and the integrity of the organism?
It's a good question. I think it's also a good sort of intuition to capture that thought that this technology, the processes that we are able to do with this technology, increases human agency. So you could say that all the relationships between humans and at least domesticated animals are unequal relationships. So there's an inequality in many ways, but also in agency. So we have different kinds of agency and different capacities. And the fact that we have sort of developed our own agency to a degree that well, it maybe impresses some people and frightens others, but I think that's an interesting sort of fact. I don't think I can say so much more than that.
Okay, Wendy Harwood came back and made a point that if the technology develops so that it can identify unintended impacts, would that make people happier? Would people be more satisfied or less worried about genome editing technology, which kind of leads to a question which other people have mentioned in terms of the technology being corporate controlled or industrial controlled, whether, you know, who's managing, who's directing the agency, whether that is important in deciding how comfortable society is with this technology. But for you, Julia, those questions are probably not less important than having a bigger change of worldview. Is that the kind? Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, I think it's all important. It's all connected. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that in McGilchrist talks about is that we need to honour science, but also reason, also intuition, and also imagination. And at the moment, the focus is on science, and a particular kind of science, at that of quite reductionist science. So it's not either or, it's everything together and getting that balance right. So, I mean, I think some people have been talking about this, but at the moment, I would, if I had a choice between accepting a GM technology that was developed by a scientist versus a shaman, I would choose the shaman's innovation or technology, because I think they have a better handle on reality. But hopefully they could work together. I think we just need to sort of combine all these faculties. And so, I mean, I think, you know, we can do biotechnology, but from a different consciousness, from a different level of consciousness, one where we're actually in collaboration with the and have a different kind of relationship with what we're working with.
Okay, Pat, we're finishing at 4:30, I'm guessing. So you're off. You're on mute, Pat.
Apologies. We have the capacity to go on a bit longer if our panelists are able to stay. What's the view? A little bit longer? Okay, Lawrence.
Okay, in which case, a question to all of you, to answer it however you choose. I'm going to frame it in a different way, but Penny Hawkins asked earlier in the proceedings. She made the point that waste is a big problem in terms of the food system and agricultural system, and it's a major factor in terms of, you know, dealing with that in terms of our strategies for climate change. She highlighted as part of that falling yield, the rate of not falling yields, but the failing or reducing rate of yield increase is a great challenge. That, you know, our ability technically to keep producing more food in the particular way that we're structured is a problem. And then the question, so that's kind of one example of where where one might take a different view of genome editing technology to deal with these great challenges. Another view that has been expressed is that if genome editing can modify or can reduce animal suffering within intensive livestock production, isn't that okay? So shouldn't one accept the technology for those reasons? So the question I'd like to put to you is, those are just two examples of challenges where people say genome editing technology might be a good thing. These are kinds of challenges. Do you think those challenges would, if you look at them, amend your view of the spectrum, the nature versus technology spectrum, and the good or bad of the agency? Does those challenges shift where you see the desirability of technology on the spectrum or not? Or do you take a more fundamentalist view, as Julia has expressed, that there is a different kind of knowledge, there is a different kind of awareness of naturalness or holistic or whole relationships that we should pay attention to, and that spectrum, how we move along that spectrum, is relatively limited? Should we start with whoever wants to start? Maybe Belinda, as you're the top of my screen.
Sure. With regard to the waste problems and yield challenges, I think that there's been way too little looking at the big picture and what are the other possible solutions to some of these challenges. It gets back to this reductionism and, you know, tunnel vision that I know in my experience, genetic engineers, you know, have a solution, they're looking for a problem and to solve it with. But, you know, yield, for example, there are all kinds of studies out there that say we have plenty of food. We can distribute it better and reduce the waste using other methods. And I think that societies, you know, as a society, as a species, we need to sit down and have bigger conversations like this one and look at all the possible solutions to the biggest challenges we're facing, not just, you know, put on the genetic engineering glasses and look at everything through those eyes. I'm not, and I'd like to point out too, that I'm not rejecting these technologies. I'm just saying we have to use them when we need to, when it's the best solution, carefully and cautiously and transparently. And that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to have a go at this?
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. So a number of years ago, I formulated what I described as the sort of biotechnology wager, and it was the idea that basically that governments like to put their faith in the potential of future biotechnologies, about which they know very little at the moment, to deliver productivity gains that will allow them to outrun, if you like, the accumulated costs of present consumption. And I sort of was thinking of a quotation from the economist Paul David when I was thinking about this, where he says, you know, governments will always prefer to put their faith in sort of promissory discourses like that, rather than tackle head on the kind of redistributive struggles that are going to make them unpopular. I'm obviously paraphrasing there, but there is a certain kind of promissory discourse that one has to be sort of slightly wary of, particularly in the sense that problems, in the way that Belinda just described it, problems of increasing production, if you like, get kind of hypothecated to particular technologies as being the sort of presumptive solution to them, when in fact one could possibly look elsewhere for it. But I think one of the things that I want to, for those solutions, one of the things that I would want to say, and I guess I tried to say at the end of my talk, is that we really need to kind of think about social interventions and biological interventions in a way that's sort of slightly symmetrical. And the reason is because, as I described it, we have to start from where we are, and we've got ourselves into a really perhaps unenviable situation through the way in which we have kind of accelerated already the use that we've made of the resources that are available from agriculture, and those, you know, these things have transformed us and have transformed our kind of social institutions in a way that makes them as difficult to change as biology is to change to us now. So I think it's important not to recognize that by taking one way or the other, you're always going to kind of face the costs of doing that. And I think, I mean, it's probably, you know, you pose the question, is, you know, could genome editing, for example, solve problems of animal disease within intensive husbandry systems? Well, potentially it has, but I mean, the question, potentially it could, but I mean, one of the questions that one has to consider in thinking about that is to what extent is adopting those technologies simply going to entrench a system that is intrinsically suspect in itself, and what are the alternatives to doing that? I mean, there are applications of genome editing, for example. I mean, so if you allow that selective breeding of large farmed animals is going to continue in order to achieve certain gains through conventional breeding, you're actually effectively going to progressively reduce the gene pool, because you're having to kind of put animals together. If you could find the trait that you're looking for and engineer it in, you could potentially expand the gene pool, because you wouldn't have to be kind of continuously kind of narrowing around the sort of elite animals or plants or whatever they are that express all of the kind of desired characteristics that you have. So there are there are things like that, but I mean the question is really needs to be posed in the context of what sort of biological and social future you're sort of looking to bring about. Thanks.
Thank you. Penny Hawkins has asked me to point out that, to clarify, that she personally does not believe that gene editing is an acceptable way to solve farm animal welfare issues. Her point was about tackling waste, and I'm afraid in my cack-handed, rather heavy, unnuanced way, I linked these things together in terms of challenges. So I apologize to Penny. Kathleen, do you have any comments to make about this? And specifically, maybe if there could be changes in, several people have asked about plant breeders' rights and so on. So do you see different legal or property structures that can help or enable this technology to be more grounded and more accessible or more transparent?
Yeah, I have some ideas on this, and I think this discussion with everyone's contribution has been so fascinating, because people have all contributed things that stimulate further discussion. What I was thinking about when I prepared this talk, I didn't have time to mention it, but perhaps now is the time, is that I spoke earlier on about plant biologists, bioengineers, and I used Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier in a way as my sort of example, my poster girls of a modern plant breeder. But I also want to talk about the opposite, a conventional small family-run farm. And in my mind, I had James Rebanks, who some of you might be familiar with. He's a Cumbrian hill farmer who published a book last year called Pastoral Farming, which is a sort of, it's an interesting book in that he talks about his grandfather and his father and their knowledge of the land that he farms, that they have farmed, that he is now farming. And he stewards, and he talks about how he changed from a very technological, industrial style of farming to try and not become necessarily a rewilder, but just to base the farm on how his grandfather farmed and how his great-great-grandfather farmed. So in this kind, and I think Mr. Rebanks is very typical of a lot of small family-run farms in the UK, whether it's in Wales or Scotland, Northern Ireland, Cornwall, Norfolk, how a lot of small farmers have domesticated the land, stewarded the land, and actually that it was in tune with nature. And what Mr. Rebanks is finding is that nature is coming back to his farm now that he's not applying a technological approach to it anymore, but he's actually doing what his, he is doing some changes. It's not that he has abandoned technology altogether. He still, I think, uses a tractor and he uses electric fencing, which is a technological solution. But what he's not doing, he's not relying on a GMO or a gene editing solution for his breeding or his application of the farm. And I think that his solution might be a solution for all of us to reconsider, is to say, why don't we look back to the past? Because the past wasn't all bad. The past didn't always just give us famine and disaster. There was a lot of traditional knowledge that was built up over the years through generations, passed on with love to the next generation to say, you know, this is how you manage the sheep in the Cumbrian Hill Farm, or this is how you grow maize in Cuba, or the best way in a drought condition to do something is this technique. And as I'm sure Belinda, who's a plant biologist more than I am, will say, plants and animals adapt very quickly, particularly plants, to changing circumstances on their own and at their own sort of speed, without necessarily a huge amount of human breeding involvement. So I hope that this hasn't been too much of a long way to answer your question. But I think that today we often think we have a problem, technology will solve it. Rather than sort of saying, well, perhaps technology created some of this mess in the first place. Let's use technology judiciously. As Belinda was saying, it's not to say that we should get rid of it completely, but we should use it when we need it, and not just as a sort of automatic, we have a problem with animal welfare. Perhaps gene technology will solve the problem of animal welfare, when you might say, well, actually industrial farming is what really is the problem. Let's reconsider that. And a conventional farmer like James Rebanks would never go down the industrial farming route. He's applying his grandfather's technique of, you know, showing a certain amount of care for your sheep and your animals, a traditional husbandry based on best practice. Finally, within the intellectual property rights movement, there is no room for this traditional heritage knowledge. There is simply no room for traditional heritage, because if you show heritage or tradition, you don't get your desired application, you won't get your patent, and you won't get your plant breeders right. And this is where I think we have a slight imbalance. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. It highlights, as ever on these discussions, more questions and more challenges. But yeah, Belinda made the point that she's not rejecting this technology. That she made the point that that not rejecting this technology, but looking at it with caution, transparency, and regulation is probably the way to go. Martin Peck, in a question and in a comment, made the point, yeah, that's fine, but you know, if money is driving everything, and money is driving patents, intellectual property rights, and so on, what chance is there to have caution, transparency, and adequate regulation? And I guess the only, or maybe the easy answer, but the obvious answer to that is to have proper transparency and proper citizen engagement. Gina, does that, how do you see citizen engagement? How do you see citizen engagement working within your criteria of wholeness and integrity and agency?
I'm glad that it was brought, that the economic aspect is brought up, and I really think very many nice things has already been said, and I agree to a lot of what the other panelists say. And I think that one critical question is about what kind of research is funded, and how research priorities are also a driving force of actually agricultural development. And when it comes to citizen engagement, I think that's a very crucial and necessary part of bringing in broader aspects, and this, especially when it comes to food. I've been concerned for a few years about different kinds of food practice and how they can how they sort of make us relate to nature and other non-human species, but also in the communities. And I think that this is an issue that really affects everyone, but does not really get as much public attention and democratic sort of involvement as it should have. So, for instance, in Norway now we have a expert group working to write or to make a recommendation whether or not we should have a relaxation of the Norwegian Gene Technology Act, and I don't think it gets much media attention, for instance. And I really believe that this this issue about food, it's we have work to do to sort of to make people aware of how much it will affect us in our everyday decisions and the decisions we are able to do and not able to do with this the regulation of these technologies.
Thank you. There's some very good things in the chat, as well as the questions and some references people have been posting that we can't get to, I'm afraid, but please do have a look at those things. One question earlier on, Lucy mentioned, Lucy made the point that, I think I got the quote right, biotechnology has changed how we talk / understand nature. And it's certainly changed maybe how we talk about it and discuss nature. Whether it's changed how we understand it, I think is still a moot point as a question. And this is the kind of thing, Julia, that's right in your consciousness and your thought, whether, you know, how we continue to understand nature, the way nature is understood from an indigenous kinds of perspective. Stephen Jacobs, by the way, made a point earlier on about the web of life and linking human activity to this wider web of life, and it's important that we try and do that. So finally, Julia, in terms of either the narrative or the understanding, is the understanding of nature moving under biotechnology? Should it? How far can it go? Okay, these are big questions. Let me just come to a point. How do we change this nature narrative to return it to something akin to the kinds of things that you were talking about, that's rooted in indigenous or traditional knowledge or traditional awareness of our relationships with what Stephen calls the web of life?
Yeah, so what I've picked up is about reconnecting with nature. I mean, obviously we have a lot to learn from other cultures, including what used to happen in, say, Western countries in the past, and still happens. It's just that it's sort of underground, but there are whole networks of herbalists and people working in bushcraft and plant. There's been a conference for the last few years in London that just didn't run recently, but called Plant Consciousness, and it had, you know, it was always oversubscribed. So these things are still happening, but it's about reconnecting with nature. And we can do that individually and as groups ourselves. We don't have to draw some sort of knowledge from other cultures, but we can learn from them. So it's about this reconnection with nature and with ourselves. And I think that's, you know, I think from putting my biodynamic hat on, that's one of the things that the contributions of biodynamics, because part of it is the methodology, sort of phenomenology, where you know, it's about you know, the structures of experience and consciousness. So we can go down that journey or that exploration ourselves. It's not, we don't pick it up from a book. We need to viscerally experience it, and anyone can do that anywhere. It's about reconnecting with the land and ourselves, and there's a whole load of healing work to do there as well. And there are methodologies to do that as well.
Lawrence, can I just quickly interject? We're about to lose one of our panelists.
I was just about to hand over to you anyway. So there you go. Even if anyone else wants to say anything else, I'm too knackered to listen. So.
Sort of like you, where to begin? You know, we put together this webinar in part in response to what we felt was a lack of clear definitions around could have occurred naturally, which was a big focus of the DEFRA public consultation. But not just a lack of clear definitions, but a lack of depth in terms of the way we think about this concept of nature and natural, and whether it is really an appropriate basis for a regulatory discussion. What's coming through to me today is that no, it's not an appropriate basis for a regulatory discussion, but it is a very appropriate basis for a discussion about what kind of farming we want in the future, and how we express these values in a way that they are actioned in the world. It's really clear to me that the terms nature and natural have a range of meanings to a lot of different people in a lot of different contexts, including consumers and regulators and organic farmers and conventional breeders. And for this reason, you know, many of those, including those of us on different sides, and quite often we find that those sides aren't so different after all, have can sometimes find this discussion about nature and natural technology to be frustrating. I found it fascinating, and I'm just so pleased that we've had such an active and involved panel to discuss it. But what it seems clear to me is that we're talking about a technology that is transformative. We accept that this is a big technology that brings with it a lot of potential that has not really yet been realized. And I wonder sometimes about, why does it need to say that it's natural? If it's a technology that works, if it's a technology that does what it says on the tin, as it were, why the hard sell to the public that this is natural? It's very clear, particularly from the dialogues that Pete was noting, that the public aren't buying it, that they have a very specific belief system around natural that just doesn't encompass this kind of thinking. So I think for technologies that claim to be transformative, that claim they're going to take us to some sort of different level, there needs to be a different approach in the way that we discuss them with the public, and the way, and this discussion about natural and nature needs to carry on, not in a regulatory context, but in a where we're going in the future context. So I'm really pleased that we've had it. I wish it could have gone on much longer. In a non-COVID world, this would have been a day-long something, and we would have hashed it out and probably had drinks at the end of it. As it is, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it today, but I am just so pleased. Thank you for all of you for coming, and those of you who stayed in the audience and contributed so fully to the discussion. We will try to save the chat, and if you've registered with us, then you'll get a notice saying when the video is ready, and I hope you'll share it with others, and we can prompt more discussions between more people about this very important topic. And I think that's where we leave it. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.